Hello, this is John from caveofprogramming.com. In this tutorial, we're going to look at init methods and destroy methods. So beans in Spring have kind of a life cycle, and you can select methods which we run after the beans are created and methods that will be run just before they are destroyed. So let's look at that. Firstly, let's take a look at the init method. So here's my person class, and I'm creating a bean from it. In fact, I create a couple of beans here because in the last tutorial I set the scope of this bean to prototype, so each request to the context will get me a new bean here. So there are two beans, and let's supposing that I want to run a method when this bean is created. Now you might immediately think that the constructor is a good is a method that does that, but what Spring allows us to do is to run a method after all the bean properties have been set. So after the bean has been fully set up and all the properties have been given their values, we can run a special method then, and obviously the constructor will be run before the properties are set because it's run when their object is instantiated. So let's look at the person class, and I'll give it a method which I'll call public void on create, and this name is not important at all. I'm just making it up off the top of my head because, as you'll see, you can select any method to be a init method, and I'm gonna just type a sysout in here, but in reality you could do something more, some kind of complex initialization in here if you wanted to. And I'll say person created, and I'll also just append here this, and since I've got a toString method, this is going to be translated into a string representation of the bean, and that will allow us to see that the bean has been properly initialized. So I've got a method to use as my init method, and I'll go to beans.xml now. And Eclipse makes it really easy. The Spring IDE plugin for Eclipse makes it really easy to add these methods, to configure them. I go to the Beans tab here, and you can see that there's a place where I can specify an init method here. If I select my person bean on the left here, then we can add the init method here on the right. So I'll just type here on create, just the name of the method, and save it. And if you look at the raw XML view now, the source, you'll see that you've added this init-method equals on create. So you could also equally well type that by hand if you prefer typing things by hand. So now let's run that, and we should see here that for every person bean that's created, we run the init method, and you can see that the people are fully initialized because the tax ID property has been set. We can also have a destroy method. So let's go to person.java and add a public, I'm in trouble typing, public void on destroy, or just call it absolutely whatever you like. And in here I'll just output sysout person destroyed, which is kind of miserable sounding, but there you go, person destroyed. Now if I run this, well, yeah, actually first I've got to configure the XML. So let's go to beans.xml, let's go to the beans tab, make sure the person bean is selected, go to find the destroy method and add in on destroy, save it, and then you can check if you like, go to the source and check that we've got a destroy method now, and this name must match the name of your method, of course. And I'll run that, and we'll see that we haven't, in fact, we're not in fact running that method. Now, the first thing to suspect is that you're not closing down your context if that happens. And if we look at app.java, but we see that we are calling close on the context, so the context should be closing. And if we look at this red debug output here, we see that it's closing the context down. It's saying stuff like, well, it says destroy singletons, So that's good. It's closing down here. But the problem is that in the last tutorial, I set the, or in a previous tutorial anyway, I set the scope of the bean to prototype. And if you have your scope set to prototype, what happens is Spring just hands you your beans, and then it says, well, here's a bean for you, do what you want with it, and kind of washes its hands of the bean in a sense after that. So if you have a bean scope to prototype, then the destroy methods are not automatically run. But if we leave the scope at the default, or if we just set it to singleton, which I could do here, or I could do it, of course, in the user interface. So I'll set scope to singleton. Then you'll see that the destroy method is run. But now we've only got one person being created, because as we saw previously, it's now a singleton. So that's init methods and destroy methods. You can also, if you want, specify a kind of global default, global for your particular XML container anyway. And to do that, again, it's easiest to use the Spring IDE plugin to do it. So let's click on beans.xml, go to the beans tab, and now I'll select the beans root element, and we can select a default init method and a default destroy method. So let's have a default init method called init, let's say, and a default destroy method called destroy. So if I save that and run it, so nothing changes now because we haven't defined in any of our classes these methods, and we've overridden this default for person anyway. But now let's take another bean. Let's look at the address bean, for example, because in beans.xml we're creating an address bean, as you can see. I can look at the raw source here, and there we go. And if you look at what happened when I edited the bean in the beans tab there, we've added the default init method and default destroy method attributes to the beans tag. So again, you could type that by hand if you wanted to. Let's just as an example, I'll go to address, and I'll have here an init method. Let's call it public void init, because of course the name has to match what I said the default init method would be. And I'll put this out in here and say bean created. Let's add this on as well, just so we can see what it is. And if I run this now hopefully it will find my my init method, because I've given it the name matching this default for an init method. So I'll make sure everything's saved and go to app and just run it. And now we can see being created address. So it's running the init method in my address bean. And of course you could add a destroy method if you wanted as well. So the defaults are only going to be run if they're actually present, and otherwise nothing changes. Okay, so that's it for this tutorial. Join me again next time, and until then, happy coding.